occasionally. So, yeah, just a little bit of background on myself. I live about an hour out of Melbourne, and I've been living here for about 11 and a half years trying to pursue a sort of sustainable lifestyle. A key part of it is goats for me, and I also do a lot of work in the sustainable living space, primarily around the edible weeds, but also, you know, mushrooms, and also teaching people about soap making and things like that. So overall, there's about 20,000 species of edible plants on the planet, and we think of some of them as weeds. And it's funny how we think about other things that are edible, which are, you know, perhaps a bit dubious as well. So it's interesting what we consider edible and what we don't consider edible. But what's a weed? You know, a weed is a plant that's useless or in the wrong place or simply bad. The other thing is that's also the way I like to see it is it's a plant whose virtues we haven't discovered yet. Okay, one example I can think of is I'm sitting here now, I've got my cup here of nettle tea. Now, nettles are really thought of as being a pretty dreadful thing by a lot of gardeners, but also an incredibly nutritious and wonderful tea. So why eat edible weeds? They're easy to grow, they're free, nutritious, delicious, all sorts of flavours to add to our culinary adventures, and also just the delight and joy of foraging versus shopping. Low food miles, fresh, local and seasonal. And just as far as nutrition goes, just one very basic example, nettle, 1 cup of blanched stinging nettle gives you about 10% of your daily recommended intake of iron, 40% of your daily recommended intake of calcium. So that's how powerful they are nutritionally. As far as being delicious, don't pay attention to me because I'm not that good a cook, but a lot of famous foraging chefs have been using edible weeds for a long time. And I've just listed a couple there, one internationally and one here in Melbourne, Ben Trury, who's very famous for using a whole lot of edible weeds in his dishes. So those sort of people are really using them. They're not always delicious, of course, because I did a wonderful edible weed walk for a small group at a school, and a young lady that I'd made a dandelion smoothie for said, Doris made us a smoothie. It contains dandelion leaves, water, a little bit, and apple juice. I didn't really like it. It was disgusting. I couldn't even finish my glass. So, you know, really, like everything, it's how you actually prepare them, of course. So what I want to cover today is what the common weeds are, where they can be found, how to harvest them, how to safely consume them, the medicinal benefits of a few weeds, and that's just a whole topic in and of itself, really, and some tips on edible weed safety. So the top 10 common ones that, you know, I would see in my area would be dandelion, catsia, milk thistle, clover, nettle, mallow, dock, onionweed, plantain and chickweed. Now, to Ross's point earlier on where he said, oh, you know, this presentation is going to be focused mainly here in Melbourne in the southeastern suburbs. It's not really the case in a way, because the plants that I'm going to be talking about today are all plants that have gone all over the globe with European settlement. So here in Australia, with the earliest settlers came a lot of these plants, and a lot of them are from European origin as far as being here, being in the United States, for example, being in Europe itself, of course, but even as you're travelling through Asia, going through Indonesia, through all sorts of countries where there's been European settlement, you'll see these plants. What tends to vary is the ones that prefer a wetter climate, or perhaps a drier climate, or a warmer climate. You'll see some variations there, of course, but a lot of these can be found all over the planet. So, you know, where can they grow? Where can you see them? And there's a whole lot of places, but your backyard, in your garden beds and veggie patches, your neighbours' gardens, community gardens, they just grow absolutely everywhere. Roadsides, empty blocks, alongside creeks and waterways, compost heaps, animal manure piles, so many different places that you'll find all of these weeds growing. And again, it'll depend what kind of microclimate each of them really likes. So how to harvest? I mean, really, a lot of them you can just tear them off by hand. You don't need to have a knife with you or anything like that. You can just pull them up. You can actually take a sharp knife with you if you like and just cut them off above ground level. Take a basket to put them in, you know, or a cooler bin or an esky or something like that. An esky, that's a very Australian name. So basically a cool box. You know, if you want to store them for longer, because they tend to be pretty delicate things, so they can wilt very easily. So good idea to just take something to keep them cool. With nettles, of course, you know, you need to wear gloves, but most things you don't have to wear gloves. Keep them as clean as possible. Cut them off above ground level rather than pull out the whole plant. So in terms of consuming them safely, just try a little bit if it's the first time that you've tried it. It may well be edible, but just because it's edible generally for humans doesn't mean that a plant's edible for you in particular, okay? So take that into account and only eat one edible weed on its own rather than a mixture, so that if you've got an adverse effect, it can be pinned back to a particular plant. Make sure you wash them well first, of course, just in case there's anything on them that might not be good for you. And know whether the plant is edible raw or whether it needs to be cooked, okay? So that's really, really important. All the ones we're going to look at today are going to be things that you don't need to cook. They can be eaten raw. So as far as medicinal uses go, there's really so many. I mean, there's hundreds, probably thousands of medicinal uses. And there I've just listed a range of issues that potentially you could be using these plants for. So it's kind of important to make sure that you use the right plant for the right thing. And, you know, this is really, it's basically very much an area you can get into in depth yourself. We'll touch on it today. You know, as I said, you know, nettles, for example, you can make a tea, highly nutritious tea that's very high in iron and calcium. So, you know, there's lots of different uses, and there's not enough time today to really go into this in detail. We'll just touch on it a little bit. So as far as edible weed safety, really super important issue, of course, because we know that people use all sorts of different herbicides and pesticides and what have you on their gardens, and so that's important to know about, and also what plants are poisonous in your area. As far as edible weeds go, I mean, probably a lookalike plant that you might think is edible, but is certainly not. In fact, it's fatally poisonous, is hemlock. And I'll talk about that a bit later on, but it's definitely one to keep in mind, particularly if you live in an area of high rainfall where hemlock grows really, really well. In your particular area, there will be specific plants that are also poisonous, and you'll need to definitely go into those in a lot more detail for your microclimate. So the contaminants that exist, look out in areas where local councils or local government have sprayed. Sometimes there's signage, as they have in some areas in Melbourne near the Mary Creek. They put little signs out that say this area has been sprayed and the date that it's been sprayed. In other areas, the sprays have got a different dye in them, like a purple dye or a pink dye or something like that. Here in the Yarra Ranges, they use a funny coloured green dye. You know, it's something to look out for, just to make sure that things have not been sprayed, particularly with herbicides, okay? They're mainly herbicides that are being used. You know, also beside roadways, there's also contaminants from vehicles. So you might just want to think, you know, twice about whether you're going to do any foraging on the roadside. So in gardens also, people's gardens, pesticides may have been used as well. So just to look out, because some of these things can't just be washed off, they might be actually in the plant. So, you know, where have these things come from? In Australia, as I said earlier, most urban area weeds arrived with the early Europeans. So in the 1700s, they came out either intentionally or unintentionally. Some of them might have been brought out for their medicinal uses, but others might have just had seeds caught in people's clothes or in pockets or what have you. And after only 14 years, the first Europeans settled here, botanists found most English weeds were growing here. So we think of a lot of plants as weeds, but also in our gardens, there's other things that we think of as ornamentals. For example, there at the bottom, there's some dahlia flowers, and they were imported into the UK in the early days because of their edible tubers. And then over time, they became basically an ornamental. So, you know, they're plants that are in our gardens that we think of purely as being ornamentals, but in fact, could also be edibles. Also, some of the edibles that we have, like, for example, pumpkins, we eat only part of it, the pumpkin, but the pumpkin leaves are just as edible and can be stewed up and cooked as a green. So the other thing to look out for before we get into the specific edible weeds is edible flowers. And I just want to drop this in here just to kind of expand your thinking about the kinds of things that might be edible in your garden and in nature. So this is just a very short list. There's actually hundreds and hundreds of edible flowers, and that again is a whole area of knowledge that I'd encourage you to look into in a bit more detail. But these again are just some of the really basic ones that a lot of people might have growing in their garden already. And even amongst those, we've got ones that have got medicinal uses, for example, calendula. Edible tree leaves is another one. Beeches, birches, mulberry leaves, which need to be cooked. Hawthorn and spruce all have leaves that, particularly when the leaves are just starting to come out and they're fresh and new, they'll be edible and can be eaten generally raw. So it's again not something we think about very often, but it's something to think about as far as when you're planning to look at different sorts of plants that you can eat. So the important thing is that the safest place to forage is in your own garden or gardens of neighbours or friends or family. And when you're foraging in public spaces, particularly where local councils and local government might have sprayed the weeds, really think twice about foraging in those places, especially highly manicured areas. If it looks nice and neat and tidy, then probably there's been some weed killers and things used to keep them looking that way. Best to go into areas which are a bit wild and look like the gardener hasn't been there for a while. They're usually the safest because they've been left alone and nothing's been done to them. The one example that I would give against that is empty lots where buildings have been pulled down. They can often be rich sources of edible weeds, but the issue is that sometimes it's really hard to know what contaminants might be there. If there's been a dry cleaning business, for example, or maybe a mechanics shop or a petrol station or something like that, there can be contaminants left behind on building sites that we're not aware of. So just think twice about those sorts of areas. So yeah, before we look at weeds specifically, not all parts of a plant might be edible. So when you ask, is this edible? Ask what part of it's edible. And we know that because, potatoes, for example, tomatoes, rhubarb, lettuce, all these sorts of things, we only eat a particular part of the plant. So just transfer that information, that knowledge across to edible weeds as well as you start to get into edible weeds. Or as you might already be eating some edible weeds as you're expanding your knowledge into other plants. Some plants need to be cooked to be edible. Again, we have an everyday example, potatoes. Plants can have poisonous lookalikes, so that's something to be really careful of, particularly as you're getting to know what certain plants look like. One in particular, chickweed, is a very common edible weed, but there's at least 2 or 3 different sorts of other very small rambling plants which look almost identical from a distance and to the untrained eye. So that's one thing that you need to just broaden your knowledge of, is the sorts of plants that you might mistake them for. And the last thing is, just because an animal or bird or an insect eats it doesn't mean it's edible for humans. I've just got a couple of follow-up slides on these issues. Yeah, not all parts of the plant may be edible, as I said earlier, but many might be. Many parts might be nasturtiums, for example. Flowers, seeds, leaves, stems, all of those parts of it. Really only the roots are the only thing that we don't eat of the nasturtium plant. So there might be multiple things that you can eat, but not necessarily. Sometimes it might just be the leaves. So that's really an important area to get into. The other thing is that I really emphasise this because I hear so many people saying this, that just because an animal, bird or insect eats it doesn't mean it's edible for humans. So, people do tend to think, it seems kind of logical, if another creature eats it, it's okay for us. One area particularly, because I do workshops on mushrooms as well, foraging for wild mushrooms, and one of the very widely held myths about mushrooms is that if a bug eats it, that mushroom variety will be edible. So I've got a picture there of a slug eating a fly agaric mushroom, and that's probably not a mushroom that you want to be eating unless you know an awful lot about how to cook it. Certainly not edible raw, and not edible unless cooked in an extremely specific way. And whilst I was doing some research on this, just as probably a little fun side fact about insects eating mushrooms, there are actually fungi which eat insects. And there's a particular type of fungi which eat ants. And that other picture there is an ant actually being consumed by a fungus, which was fairly terrifying, but very fascinating. All right, so we're going to get into a few of the weeds now, because that's primarily what I'm sure everyone's here for. And the dandelion is always the one I'll put up first, because it's been listed by the US Department of Agriculture as being among the top 4 green plants in terms of nutrition. So if you were thinking, which edible weed am I going to eat? If you can find dandelions, this would be at the top of your list in terms of tradition of nutrition. It's got the broadest range of nutrients of any of the edible weeds, and is far more nutritious than most of the lettuces and salad greens and things like that you're putting on your plate probably at the moment, including ones from your own garden. So the 2 pictures I've got there are the dandelion flowers, which a lot of people would be familiar with, and then on the other side, the right-hand side, the plant, but also with the seed head, and that's when the flower turns to seeds, that's what happens. So I think it would be one that most people would be familiar with if they've got any sort of interest in this area. And even people who don't, that it tends to be one that we know as kids blowing the seeds off the top of the dandelion, those sorts of things. So, yeah, so the dandelion is definitely one of the ones that, we see around a lot, one of the most common in many, many different areas. So it's been said to be a unique combination of vitamins, minerals, trace elements and other biologically active substances, which are in a ratio, intriguingly, optimally for the human body. It's almost like they've been designed for us in terms of nutrition. So I generally use the leaves myself. I use them in salads, or else I use them in green smoothies. The other thing is that you can also use them, use the flowers as well. There's many different ways you can use them. One of the most basic ones is using them in cakes. Just using the actual petals gives the cake a beautiful colour and adds some vitamin C. It's a great blood builder and purifier. So dandelion has got quite a lot of nutrients in it, which are really good for cleansing the blood and the liver. So known as a liver cleanser, and also rich in all those specific minerals that are listed there on the slide. So it's got quite a bitter flavour, which can put people off, but it's that bitter flavour which is an indicator that it's doing all of those good things for your body. You can also make a coffee from the root of the dandelion, which is a great substitute for regular coffee. Certainly here in Melbourne, you can actually buy it off the shelf from health food shops, and it's actually a really lovely tasting coffee substitute. The other thing you can do with the leaves is also to make dandelion tea with the actual leaves themselves. So there's a range of different things that you can use the dandelion for, and probably one of the most obvious in terms of the look of it. The leaves have got those pointy teeth-like sort of that shape. Sometimes they can be a little bit rounder, but dandelion tends to be the only thing that can be confused with is things like endives and chicories and those sorts of things, and catsia, all of which are edible as well. So it doesn't have really a poisonous look-alike. So a great safe one to really start with if you're a beginner. One of the lookalikes to dandelion is something called catsia. I don't know about in the States and other parts of the world, but certainly here in Melbourne, if people have got a lawn that they're growing and they're looking for a lovely grass lawn, one of the things that tends to come up and drive people a bit crazy is catsia. So the picture that I've got there on the left-hand side is a close-up of it, and you can see how it grows as a little rosette. Usually quite flat to the ground. In fact, in Sydney, it's called flatweed. We don't call it flatweed here. Quite interesting how we've got different names for the same plants. And that actually, talking to people from all over the place, one of the things that you do find is that sometimes the same weed will have very different names in a whole lot of different places. So it can be, you have to be quite careful when we're talking to each other across different places because the names may vary considerably. And so that's where the scientific names come in very handy as well, but also using a range of different photos so that we're all clear about what we're talking about. The interesting thing about cat's ear or flatweed is that when it grows in a lawn area where it's being mowed all the time, it tends to grow really flat, as this does, you can see. But the picture on the right, you can see how it grows a little bit more naturally if it's in an area where it's not being mowed. It tends to be quite a long-lived plant, so the roots stay in the ground for a long time. And so it can sort of develop a way of growing over time that suits the environment it's in. And certainly, you know, that's what's happened with cat's ear. When they're growing in a lawn, they tend to grow flat to keep away from the lawnmower blades. But when they're growing in a natural environment, you'll find that they're much more upright. So just going from flat to just upright, almost like a lettuce or a grass or something like that. So they can look a little bit different in different environments. And you can see there that it's a really good picture, that one, because it shows how, unlike the dandelion, which has very pointy, sharp points on its leaves, these are much softer and rounder on the cat's ear. So it's a very soft, round sort of wave to the edge of the leaf, not that jagged shape that you get on the dandelion. The other thing about cat's ear, it's called cat's ear because in theory it's soft like a cat's ear. If you can tell from that photo, but it does have fine hairs on top, whereas the dandelion is really, really smooth. So yeah, well, that's what you'll find is that to tell the difference, the cat's ear has also that incredibly furry sort of feel to it. So, which brings me to a point I like to make in my presentations about edible weeds is that in order to get an idea of what weeds are edible, it's good to use all of our senses, probably not hearing so much, although that can be helpful too, but not just looking at plants, but actually feeling some of them, as long as you know that they're okay to feel, like not nettles, obviously, or poison ivy. I don't know we have that here, but I know certainly in the States it's something. But feeling plants, the texture, and also, yeah, really just getting in there with the plant and just understanding it, not just from the point of view of looking at it. And then as you get a bit more confident, just tasting tiny bits. So yeah, so the cat's ear is very big in Greek culture. So it tends to be in the old-fashioned way. It used to be boiled. These days we would steam it. That would be adequate. Boiled up and then used basically as a spinach. So it's hot, bit of lemon juice and olive oil and garlic over the top of it, kind of thing. That would be very typical Greek dish to accompany other things, you know. Almost as nutritious as dandelion. Because of that furriness, it can be eaten raw, but it's just not a nice texture to put into your salads. So a good thing to include as a cooked vegetable. Okay, so we'll cover off a few more. Yeah, this one, purslane, is it's sort of the wrong season to be talking about purslane because it's very seasonal. A lot of weeds are not seasonal. You'll see dandelions and cat's ear year round, but purslane is very much a summer vegetable, and you'll see it popping up sort of as summer starts to get going, and then towards sort of mid-autumn, it's kind of pretty much disappeared and died back, and the seeds lie dormant for a long time. So yeah, purslane is really one that you see growing as a ground cover. Very, very flat and tends to go out and cover large parts of an area. It's incredibly tenacious. It's the kind of thing you'll see growing up between you know, bits of concrete in the footpath, in the pavement. And it's also an incredible one from a point of view of nutrition because it's very high in omega-3 fatty acids. So, you know, if you're wanting to replace the fish oil tablets and those sorts of things, this is another source of omega-3 fatty acids, is the purslane. So I really would encourage people to look out for that one over the summertime. It's an intriguing one here in Australia because it's it came in with European settlement, but it was actually here beforehand. It was actually an indigenous plant and arguably a bush food here, because indigenous populations were using this prior to European settlement coming into the country, and it was found here. So indigenous cultures, rather than using the leaves, the stems in salads in the way that Europeans might, actually take the seeds and grind them and make them into a flour, or cook them as a porridge. They're a little bit like chia seeds, and they're a little bit gelatinous. They make a really nice little porridge, but also can be ground and made into a flour as well. The seeds are very small. They're about 0.5 millimetre across. As a bit of research one year, I did take some of the seeds from purslane. I had about a square metre of purslane, and I pulled it all out and then seed saved all the seeds. And I got about, I don't know, an incredibly small jar of seeds. So they're quite prolific, but yeah, certainly you'd have to collect a lot of plant to collect seeds. Again, one in Greek culture gets used a lot as well. Basically used in salads. It's got a really nice crunchy texture. It's a sort of the word's succulent. That's the word I'm looking for. It's a succulent, and so yeah, quite a lot of juice and crunchiness, and so really nice things to add to salads. The stems, even though they look quite different to the leaves, are actually almost exactly the same texture when you're eating them. So you don't have to be picking all the impossibly small leaves off. You can put little clusters, I like to call them, little clusters of purslane into your salads. That's a really nice way to do it. But it can be cooked, and in the Lebanese culture, they're cooked into purslane pies. When they're cooked, they're a little bit like okra. If you're a fan of okra, you'll be a fan of cooked purslane. If you don't like okra, you certainly won't like cooked purslane, because it's got the same gelatinous, sliminess to it, which is appealing to some people but not to others. But that's the way it tends to cook up. Okay, so the uses of purslane can be traced back at least 2,000 years in India and Iran. And in some of these cultures, it's seen as a vegetable. So the fact that we, in some places, see certain things as weeds is really just an historical thing. It's something in my mind that I do wonder how we had all this European settlement here, particularly from the UK originally, and the foraging didn't seem to sort of translate. It certainly has in other European cultures, like people from Italian backgrounds and Greek and all sorts of Eastern European cultures seem to have sort of brought their foraging traditions over to Australia, but I don't know, possibly because originally when people came over from the UK, there just wasn't a lot of their own plants that they knew about foraging actually growing here. So I don't know, but that's been quite interesting how that didn't translate. But a number of them, as I say, we've got a very big Greek population here in Victoria, in Melbourne in particular, Melbourne, Australia. And this one, purslane, it's known as glistrida, which is a very onomatopoeic sort of word. I think it's because of that glistening sort of, juiciness that it gets when it's cooked. Yeah, again, it's used by a lot of high-profile restaurant chefs, both here and in Australia, to cook purslane in dishes. It also is lovely on bread if you're making a sandwich with what have you, because of that lovely crunchiness and freshness. It's great on sandwiches. It doesn't have a strong flavour at all. It's quite bland, so not at all offensive in any sort of way. Apart from the as I said, the texture, it's not a very strong flavour, but very high in not only in omega-3 fatty acids, but also in a range of other nutrients as well. But in particular, where it's quite different to any other edible weeds is the omega-3 fatty acids that it does have. Okay, I'm just taking a sidetrack from the edible weeds for a second. I was running an edible weed walk here at my place a few years ago, and was blessed with having a woman from the Victorian Basket Weavers Association coming along. And as we walked along and I was talking about the various plants that were edible, she pulled out some reeds from a bit of a pond that I had. And she started, as we walked, she started weaving string and making a piece of string by hand out of the reeds from the pond. And what was interesting to me was that it started expanding my mind a bit beyond the edible weeds that were out there to some of the plants that were growing naturally around me, and their uses over and above being edible and being medicinal, that in fact you could do other things with them, which is sort of obvious when you think about it, but you know, it wasn't something I'd sort of thought about enough up until then. And there are a range of these things, and I've got a list there. Most of these things are very weedy sort of plants, and actually a lot of them are growing in my garden. And since that time, as well as looking for edible weeds, I look for weeds that I can do things like make string and make baskets out of. And some of those strings that I make, I can use to tie up tomato plants or what have you in the garden. They're a lovely substitute for purchasing these sorts of things. And also there's just the satisfaction of actually, of course, making them yourself, and the self-reliance of using things in the natural environment for purposes that, you know, we might otherwise have to purchase something. So I'm not obviously going to spend a lot of time on that. It's just something I just wanted to sort of throw that little bit in there. And just sort of suggest that perhaps, you know, if you're thinking about uses for weeds, you know, think about their edible uses, think about their medicinal uses, but think about other things that possibly they could be used for as well. And certainly weaving and string making, cordage and basket making and container making is another one. Okay, so probably second to dandelion in terms of a weed that everyone knows about. Just got to take a sip and just yeah, okay. So yeah, clover is again incredibly pervasive across any sort of areas where there's been European settlement. Here around Melbourne, Australia, there's certainly clover to be found everywhere. It's coming up, it's very lush at the moment as we're sort of coming in towards our winter time now. It's so common that I suppose we don't even really think about it. It's just something you grow up with. You know, the idea of the lucky four-leaf clover is something that we're all sort of familiar with as kids, looking for four-leaf clovers. And again, another one of our most common edible weeds. Another one, really great one for beginners, of course, because it's pretty hard to confuse clover with anything else. There's not a lot of things that look like clover. And so you can be pretty certain and feel pretty confident that what you're actually foraging is edible clover and not something else. So I definitely suggest for people to look out for that one in their garden and to start considering using it. It does have one lookalike, and I'm just going to grab it because I've got a fresh one here. So we'll see if we can, oh, that was a good chance to stand up, stretch the legs. Okay, let's try and put that out there. There we go, ta-da, ta-da. So that is something that's very similar to clover in that it's trifoliate. It's got 3 leaves on one stem. I hope you can see that pretty well. I'll move out of the way, put it a bit closer. So that's a plant that we call oxalis. So again, probably there's a few groans in the audience from a few people who've actually got that in their garden, because it just can take over like mad. But yeah, oxalis is something that you can confuse with clover. But the good news is that oxalis is also just as edible as clover. So in fact, you've got 2 pretty similar looking plants, both of them edible. Clover has little round leaves, as you can see from the picture, and oxalis little heart-shaped leaves. So the thing with those two plants is the taste is quite different. Oxalis, you'll find, is very sharp and lemony. A lot of people just love it. It's got this tang of lemon, and that can be just thrown in salads and things as well, or into a sandwich. Lovely and tangy. One thing that people like to comment on as far as oxalis is that it's high in oxalic acid. And it certainly is high in oxalic acid, but you would probably need to eat a small truckload of it for it to cause you any issues. Or if you've got kidney issues, certainly oxalic acid is not something you want to include in your diet in large quantities. But a lot of plants that we eat, like parsley, for example, also have oxalic acid in them. So it's certainly not something that means that a plant's not edible. It just means that you don't want to eat that plant in unusually high quantities. So that's oxalis. Coming back to clover. Clover is completely different in flavour. It's got, the Japanese have got this lovely word umami, which means it's something sort of quite meaty and mouth filling flavour, and warm is a word that comes to mind. Not at all bitter. Actually, really lovely flavour. So clover is quite different, but something again that you can put on a salad or include in a sandwich. Probably the only downside of clover is that it's so small, it's tricky to harvest. Personally, what I do is, because it's got the long stems, generally I put my fingers underneath the leaves and then cut them off with scissors just underneath my hand, so that I've collected a handful of the leaves rather than collecting, you know, all the stems and then having to de-stem them later. Stems are also edible, just a little bit crunchier. There is what we call a counter-indication for clover, which is that it's also quite high in estrogens. So it's something to look out for anyone who might be pregnant, and also just in terms of anyone who's looking out as to their own estrogen intake. On the upside, it could be something that could be helpful postmenopausally as well, because of that estrogen. But just something to look out for. As I said earlier, even though certain plants are edible, doesn't mean that they're good for everyone, and it doesn't mean that they're necessarily something that everyone should include in their diet at all or in large quantities. So, you know, take this as general advice, and just make sure that if you're trying particular plants, that they're going to be okay for you. Okay, mallow. Mallow, again, is one of the most common that we see here in Melbourne. It grows into quite large bushes. One of the reasons it's so common is that it doesn't need particularly good soil or anything to grow in. It's quite happy growing in some very lean sort of soil. It can grow into quite large bushes, up to about 1 metre or 2 tall sometimes, but probably not 2 metres, 1.5 metres, let's say. But I've certainly seen bushes 1.5 metres tall and 1.5 metres wide. And once they get to that stage, they're really, really hard to get out of the ground. Mallow is one of my favourite edible weeds. It's got virtually no flavour at all, but it's just got a really nice, lovely texture, and it's full of nutrients, and is something you can just put into a stew or a soup or anything like that. And medicinally, it's really great to make a tea for sore throats. The good thing about mallow is, again, a little bit like the purslane we talked about earlier. It's somewhat mucilaginous when it's cooked or warm, and so that mucilaginous nature makes it really, really soothing for a sore throat. It's really, really lovely to use it as a herbal tea. For example, today, after I've been talking for a while, a mallow tea would be really soothing for, you know, a slightly overworked throat or cold coming on, or any of those sorts of things. So I think Ross had a bit of a tickle in his throat earlier, and a bit of mallow tea would have been quite soothing. So yeah, so the thing with mallow, just from a practical point of view, is that the leaves are lovely and soft, but the stalk is quite woody. So it's not nice to eat the stalk. So it's good to cut the leaves off just where they connect to the stalk and not, you know, include the stalk in the cooking at all, even though it's perfectly edible, but just texturally it's not very nice. So it's another one of those ones where you just want to just nip it off just underneath the actual stalk. So I've just got a picture of myself there from a few years ago when I went to Egypt, and there I had a traditional Egyptian soup called melakaya. It's quite traditional across many areas of the Middle East, and it's basically it's a little bit like a nettle soup. It's very, very, very heavily based on mallow, so large quantity of mallow. You can see the bowl in the middle. It's basically like a green soup, and that malakaya is it's like a traditional sort of peasant dish, and certainly when you do order it in somewhere like that, people appreciate it because you're looking to try a really traditional local dish. I think it's made with a bit of garlic and olive oil. I don't think it uses a stock base as such. Well, I can't remember the exact way in which that one was made. But then it's usually eaten with some poached chicken on the side and some steamed rice. And sometimes the soup is put over the chicken and the rice, or vice versa, the chicken and the rice is put into the soup. So the leaves, again, lots of vitamins and minerals, including calcium and iron. And because of that very, very subtle flavour, you can add them to whatever dish you're having without it offending anyone who doesn't like, for example, a really strong tasting green like a spinach or something like that. It's actually much easier, much more palatable than something that's so strong tasting or so bitter or whatever. So it tends to combine very well with rice and cracked wheat in particular. So there's a dish like Persian mallow and rice, again coming from that area. And very quite fascinatingly, a few years ago I did a talk for the Rotary Club here in Healesville, and there was an Egyptian man who was a member of the Rotary Club, and at the end of it he came up and he gifted me this this packet of green frozen stuff, which was frozen mallow that had come from an Egyptian delicatessen here in Melbourne. So that was really, really fascinating, and shows that in a way within that culture, it's basically mallows being used the same way that people here from a more European background might have packets of frozen spinach sitting in the freezer. So yeah, so I really encourage people to try mallow. Again, the good thing about mallow as a beginner is that you won't confuse it with anything else. It's something that you'll find quite easy to identify. You know, people sometimes confuse it with geraniums, but if you go up and feel the leaves, these are mallows, very thin and papery, and geranium leaves are much more substantial. They're thicker, a bit woolly. These are not at all woolly. So actually, I'll use this as an opportunity while I'm thinking about it to say that it's great to have a look at all these pictures and to attend these sorts of workshops and things. But the thing is that before sort of embarking as a beginner on foraging, it's a great thing to go along on a foraging walk or an edible weeds walk, as people sometimes call it, and actually have an opportunity to have someone show you the specific plants actually growing. And if you're fortunate enough to be able to do an edible weed walk somewhere where it's organic and you know there's no pesticides, actually taste the plants as well. The other advantage of going out and having a look at them in the wild is that you're looking at the plants at different stages of their lives, and as human beings look different at different stages of our lives, so do plants. So a quite small plant will look very different to a fully mature plant that might be going to seed or what have you. So yeah, seeing the difference between juvenile plants and more mature plants is really important, and seeing the difference between plants growing in different sorts of soil and different sorts of environments is also really important. So I'd really encourage you, if you can, to be able to go out on some edible weed walks at different times of the year, different seasons, and to just, you know, develop an eye for the same sort of plant growing in different ways and in different stages. So anyway, that's just a little digression just to put in a plug for edible weed walks, because it's a really, really useful thing to do, particularly as a follow-up to something like this. Which brings me to one of my absolute all-time favourites, onion weed. So I will use a scientific name here, Allium triquetum. So Allium triquetum, and the thing is, we call it onion weed here in Melbourne. Goodness knows what people call it in other places. It is called three-cornered leek, I believe, in the UK. So I've got some pictures there, and I've got some here as well. So just a tick, we'll get the fresh one. So it's just coming up again in my garden at the moment, and let's have a look. So there's the plant here, and here we go. Try not to drop too much dirt on my keyboard. The little bulbs there that you've got under the ground growing as well. So quite white at the bottom because it's in the middle of the soil, and then, you know, with these green leafy bits. And I just want to hold that up really close, because the thing is, a lot of strappy leafy things look the same, but the thing about the onion weed is it's got this kind of little ridge down the middle. And all the leaves have got this little ridge down the middle. So, you know, if you're looking at something green in the garden and you're wondering if it's onion weed, it's got to have that little ridge. If the leaf's flat without a ridge, it's definitely not onion weed. You can see that pretty clearly from the photos there on the screen as well. And the other thing, which is basically the most obvious thing about onion weed, and again why I say use your different senses, is if you break a piece off and smell it, it'll smell like onion. So that's a great way to tell whether something is onion weed or not. So onion weed tends again to be very seasonal. So it starts coming up in mid-autumn. Here in Melbourne, it's been coming up for a while now, mid-autumn, and then it goes all the way through winter, which is great because it provides you an edible weed that that has an onion flavour all through winter. And then in the springtime, like a lot of other bulbs in the garden, once it's flowered, the plant starts to die down. It gets all yellow, sort of disappears, and then it's going dormant. It's not dying, it's just going dormant, and the little bulbs under the ground will stay there until they come up again the following autumn. So the great thing about onion weed is that all parts of the plant are edible. So we talked about that earlier. All parts of the plant are edible. You can eat the leaves, you can eat the flowers, you can eat the seed pods, and you can eat the bulbs. Mainly I use the leaves. I just cut them off with a sharp knife just above ground level, and they will keep growing if it's the middle of the season. So I cut them off just above ground level, and then if I'm making, say a pasta sauce, or I'm making a stew or something like that, instead of sautéing onions in oil, I'll chop it up really finely, just like I might do chives or spring onion, and I sauté that in place of onion. The sort of flavour that it has, I would describe it as being a softer flavour, a bit more like leek. Rather than actually an onion, a strong onion flavour. So it's quite a soft leek sort of flavour. I don't know about other parts of the world, but certainly here in Melbourne, leeks are incredibly expensive. I think they're about $3 each or something. So it's wonderful to have nature's alternative freely available. And yeah, so basically just using it that way. One of the great dishes that I make quite regularly at home is potato and onion weed soup. It's great if you're growing your own potatoes. It's lovely to use what you've got at home to make a dish with, and really, yeah, great tasting dish. And then really anything to do with potatoes is great with onion weed. And Then as the flowers come on, they can be used as a garnish on soups or on anything really. They've got quite a flavour with the onion as the
Hello, everyone. Looks like we might be having a little bit of technical issues with Doris's connection. So just bear with us. I think we did have this earlier in the workshop and she was able to reconnect and get going again. So we might just give it a few moments. Okay, well, it does look like Doris is having some prolonged connection issues. So we may need to wrap it up there, and unfortunately may not get to put some of those really good questions that I've seen. Oh, this is Doris now. Nope. Nope. So yeah, those really good questions. I can try and oh, here's Doris. She's back again. Okay, great.
back again.
Back again, great. Thanks, Doris. We've still got most people here. Yeah.
I think it was the technology probably telling me that I'd spoken for too long without taking some questions. So we might take some questions if
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So we've got a couple in the chat line. Firstly, from Louis, can we grow an edible weed garden?
Oh, look, that's such a great question. I love that question. You certainly can grow an edible weed garden, just like everything else. One of the ways you can do it is the way that I've been doing it at my place over the years, which is just pulling out and eradicating all the non-edible weeds and letting the other ones just go to seed. And so that just encouraging them by natural selection, basically. So, you know, for example, with your mallow, your dandelions, all those things, they'll go to seed and they'll just come back again. So That's one way of doing it. You can actually buy some seeds online. There's a group called the Italian Gardener. You can buy dandelion seeds from them, purslane seeds from them, nettle seeds. So I'd encourage you to have a look at your various seed providers, particularly vegetable seeds, and a number of them will have, certainly the ones that come to mind would be dandelion, purslane, nettles, chicory. Yeah, so that would be it, or harvest your own. If you see dandelions out there growing somewhere outside your garden, harvest the seed heads and plant them at home. So yeah, you can certainly do that. I think it's a great idea to encourage some of those things in your own garden.
Absolutely. I think I've got quite a few of these weeds that you've mentioned today, Doris, growing in my garden already. And it's
lovely.
funny to think I spend so much time picking them out and putting them in the green bin when they could actually be the next meal.
Oh, indeed. Yes, I was visiting a friend of mine a couple of years ago, and we had a chat, and then we started talking about edible weeds, and I was telling her about onion weed. She's a very big cook. She loves to cook. And I was telling her about onion weed, and we went out the back and had a hearty laugh because the day before her husband had got out the whippersnipper, the brush cutter, and had mowed down this whole area of onion weed in their garden.
Yeah. No, it must be a very versatile ingredient. I know I put leek in my pumpkin soup, and
perfect. Yeah,
I could save myself a lot of trouble by just maybe replacing that with onion weed.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's a great idea. Actually, pumpkin soup, onion weed would be fantastic in pumpkin soup. I mean, one thing I do have to say, which I haven't said yet, which is important, is that I know that there's a lot of people who are really passionate about indigenous plants, native plants, and ensuring that areas which are being revegetated with those sorts of plants don't get invaded by these European invaders. So I guess that part of growing your own edible weed garden at home is being cognizant of that, and just to make sure that your edible weeds aren't getting out into environments that people don't want them in or prefer not to see them in. Just to be a responsible edible weed grower, I guess, is important.
Good point. So next question is how to make a mallow tea. You may have actually answered this one in the mallow plant section, but the question is, do you use the fresh leaves?
Yeah, look, it's often a question people have, is whether you use the fresh leaves or the dried leaves. And yet drying plants doesn't magically turn them into a special sort of herbal tea. Most things you can have, make a herbal tea out of, you can have them dried or fresh. It really doesn't matter. So you can go out and pick a few mallow leaves, pop them into your teacup, and then just pour boiling water over them. And generally, if you're making like a herbal infusion, you want to wait probably about 5 minutes for it to actually infuse and to make sure that you get all the goodness out of the plant. And that's kind of true for mallow tea, but also true for other things as well. I've just got something I'll just show on the screen here. I've got my jar here of, where's my label? There's a label of nettle tea. So that's dried nettles. So what I do is when the nettles come up, I cut them off. I might cut the whole plant off just above ground level, and then tie them together in a little bundle and hang them up on a hook in the kitchen. And you can do that with any number of plants, is just to dry them. You can dry them in the oven if you want to do it quicker, or on, one of those dehydrators that you might dry, peaches or plums or what have you. You can dry any of your herbal teas that way. It's a kind of a practical thing as much as anything. Sometimes if I'm feeling like a mallow tea, I don't necessarily want to go wandering out to the garden to get the mallow. I could just grab some on the shelf. But in terms of actually the quality of the tea, it's really no different whether you're making it from fresh leaves or from dried leaves.
Great. There's a few questions here around whether we'll send the the slides or the link to the information here. And yes, we are recording this session, and so with Doris's permission, I think it's okay with you, Doris, is it, that we distribute the presentation
Yep, sure, absolutely.
for the
Yep,
Smart Garden program?
yep, for sure.
And so hopefully that answers that question. We will send it directly to attendees, and we will also put it on the My Smart Garden website, and the link to that website is further down in the chat line.
Yep.
And we have a question here on whether there's any information you're able to provide on Indigenous Australian medicinal weeds. Or is this...
Australian Indigenous medicinal weeds.
Yeah.
Oh, let me think. Oh, look, it's such a huge area. I mean, it's hard to know where to begin, really. And I'm certainly not an expert in that area at all. In fact, it's really hard to find a lot of information on that topic for Australian plants. I mean, there's certainly a lot of Australian plants, Indigenous plants, which are edible, and many which are also medicinal, of course. And yeah, I really wouldn't know where to begin to answer that question in just in just a minute or two here. So I would direct people, if you're interested in that topic, is to look for workshops that are around in your local area on bush foods. We have a really great bush foods workshop that runs out of our Healesville Living and Learning Centre here in Healesville. It's a multi-week program that covers edibility and also medicinal uses. So that sort of bush tucker program would definitely be the place to find that sort of information.
Great. And a question here around any books you would recommend. And I know you've offered a few books of your own. Yep. on edible weeds.
Yep, totally. Yep. Yeah, it's certainly, yeah, as far as for beginners, definitely my book, Edible Weeds and Garden Plants of Melbourne, that despite the title, which indicates it's only for Melbourne, it's actually for all plants, all edible weeds of any temperate, regions or even subtropical regions that have had European settlement. And also my book on mushroom foraging as well, which is firmly focused at the beginners. So both of those books are available at edibleweeds.com.au online, and there's also, for people here in Melbourne, there's a list of bookstores that that also keep my book, and that's on the website edibleweeds.com.au as well. And I also have a Facebook page called Hello Little Weed, which I don't post on frequently, but I do post every now and then some information, so little updates or little snippets of information on different weeds or things related to the whole edible weed space. So yeah, Hello Little Weed on Facebook. I'd encourage people to just subscribe to that for any updates that come up. And look, there's just these days there's such a wealth of edible weed books out there. And I'd say, apart from the more general ones, great to look out for ones that are specific to your area. And as well as the books that are specific to your area, I'd also encourage people to go for edible weed walks in their area. Anyone here that's from Sydney, if you haven't heard of Diego Bonetto yet, he's sort of Mr. Edible Weeds Sydney. He regularly runs foraging walks and is incredibly passionate about edible weeds. And also would be holding mushroom tours at the moment too. But Diego is a great wealth of knowledge. I just noticed on Facebook the other day too, there's a fellow named David Diggles who's just started running edible weed walks recently in Brisbane area. So, and I see more and more as the topic of edible weeds becomes more broadly of interest, there seems to be more and more people starting to run foraging walks around the place. Certainly here in Melbourne, there's at least half a dozen people who are now pretty much regularly holding edible weed walks. I hold them myself here at my place in Healesville on my property. So that's an option again if people are interested in doing an edible weed walk with me. Edibleweeds.com.au, and you can organise a walk here. I don't run them as big events. I just run them just privately for people at this stage. But there's a lot of the community houses as well. I notice run them. And also Ceres in Brunswick, I believe, have an edible weeds workshop.
Thanks, Doris. That's a great wealth of leads there that people can follow up. And if there's not any further questions, and again, welcome you to put any questions you might have into the chat line. I wonder, Doris, is there any concluding further information to the presentation, or had you almost got to the end of it?
I actually got to the I got to the last slide actually, so it was really fortuitous timing. My last slide was basically just to say we haven't talked a lot about the poisonous plants, because I find that it can be a bit confusing when people walk away from an edible weed workshop, and you know, you've talked about poisonous and non-poisonous plants, and they can walk away thinking, oh no, what was that? Was that poisonous or not poisonous? So I would ask people in the Melbourne area to do some research on a plant called hemlock, because that one is fatally poisonous and can be confused with edible weeds, and grows a lot here in the Yarra Ranges. Not so much in Western Victoria where they have a drier climate, but certainly if you're living in a very damp climate, then hemlock is just everywhere. So please familiarise yourself with that one. And anyone else who, from whatever areas you're in, as well as familiarising yourself with edible weeds, please do familiarise yourself with the plants in your specific area, which might be poisonous if ingested. And also just to reinforce again that even if a plant is edible, just try it in small quantities first, because you don't know how it's going to agree with you. I mean, peanuts are edible, but they're fatal to some people. So, you know, I think that's really important. I mean, a few years ago, a friend of mine asked me about a particular plant which was edible, plantain. And she made herself a salad of almost exclusively plantain. And the thing is that plantain is incredibly astringent, and it caused her to get a bad tummy ache. And she came back to me and said, you told me that plant was edible, it's not edible, blah, blah, blah. And so, yes, it is edible, but, you know, a little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing, as they say. And certainly, you know, with the knowledge that it probably just should be eaten in small quantities, which is something that I now specify to people. You know, that's kind of important, because that super astringency, you know, probably just disagreed with her purely because of the astringency, not because the plant was inedible. So yeah, trying things in small quantities, and you know, put it in your mouth first and have a little chew on it, and you know, and if it burns the inside of your mouth or gives you some really unpleasant reaction, then you don't need to swallow it to find out that there's something wrong with it. You know, there's also the sort of survival strategy technique where you just take a little bit of the plant and just rub it on your hand, on your skin, and let it sit there for about 5 minutes and wait to see whether you break out in a rash or have some sort of negative reaction. Because you don't need to go as far as eating something to find out if it's you know, if it's not good for you. So you know, you can do a little bit of that, and then you can just rub it on your lip a little bit as a second thing. Third thing, you put a little bit in your mouth, again just waiting, and then finally actually swallowing, again just a small amount. And if you take that kind of really measured approach to trying new plants, you're much less likely to have some sort of negative reaction, you know, significant negative reaction to the plant, than you are, you know, woofing down a big salad of it as a first go. So yeah, I think that's a really important one for people to think about as you're entering into trying new plants, is just, you know, taking it gingerly. And I think also importantly is to just try them individually first, because again, if you put together a mixed salad of something and something disagrees, it's really hard to tell what it was. which also applies really importantly to mushrooms as well, because, you know, again, if you've eaten a mixed dish of stir-fry of mushrooms and you're not sure which one it was that was a problem, you know, trying them all individually first is a much safer sort of approach. And particularly also with kids as well, you know, I mean, again, they can have even stronger reactions to things. So just being smaller, you know, very small quantities to start with, and then just build up as you build some confidence in a particular plant being okay for you to eat. The most difficult is where you've got a few different plants growing together, and sometimes it can be a bit hard to make sure that you've picked the right thing. I mentioned chickweed earlier, which is a bit of a rambling sort of ground cover, but chickweed tends to grow almost exactly the same time as two other creeping ground covers. One's called creeping speedwell, and the other one, oh, I've just had a mental block. I forgot what it is now. Oh! Anyway, there's that's right, Scarlet Pimpernel. So you've got Scarlet Pimpernel, you've got creeping speedwell, and then you've got the edible one, which is the chickweed, and you tend to get them all kind of growing together in a patch. Once you get to know the leaves and you get to know the flowers, they've got completely different coloured flowers. Chickweed is white, creeping speedwell is blue, and the third one is orange, Scarlet Pimpernel. So, you know, they're quite different, but as a beginning forager, it's easy to leap in there and think, oh, there we go, there's the chickweed. I'll just grab a big basket full of that, and not realise that you've actually got 3 different plants all entangled. And I did myself once, not wearing glasses, which I should have been, was picking some chickweed, and I actually picked a bit up and put it in my mouth, and it burnt the inside of burnt my tongue slightly, not horribly, but just, you know, ouch, there's something wrong with that. And it was the Scarlet Pimpernel that I'd eaten that I'd put in my mouth by mistake. So yeah, approaching with caution is important, and just keeping away from areas where you know that there's some sort of contaminants being used. You know, just be really mindful of the sorts of areas that you go into. And I think the other thing is that also to take a sharing perspective, the same as foraging everything else. You don't need to remove every single plant in that area. If you find something lovely to forage, take a little bit, leave some for someone else. Things like dandelions are really cut and come again sort of plants. So you can cut off a dandelion and it'll sit there for years, literally just regrowing leaves. So it's not necessary to harvest it by pulling it out from the roots. And in fact, if you leave it there and just leave the root in the ground, you'll find that you can just keep, you know, eating from it for some time. And also other people can as well. It's not just, you know, providing a meal for one person. You're allowing it to continue to provide meals ongoing, whether it's for yourself, for other people, for animals, or what have you. So taking a kind of mindful approach and an approach that you're sharing the plants, not just, you know, ravaging whatever you can take, but just being very mindful of that sharing. I think those are all kind of, you know, things around the kind of, you know, the ethics of foraging, I guess, you know, are kind of really important. And you know, and sometimes those plants are useful for other things. I mean, dandelion flowers are incredibly useful for bees. So, you know, you just taking a few leaves and leaving the flowers, you're leaving them for the bees as well. So, you know, there's kind of really important reasons not to remove some of these things. You know, some of these plants are coming up when there's nothing else available for bees to forage, for example. So, yeah, I think that's just something that's important for people to be aware of. You know, share the knowledge. Let other people know that you're getting involved in trying all these different plants, and try to encourage other people. And I think that I see that there's really increasing interest in the whole area of edible weeds. And that's a really great thing. And more than anything, get out there and really start giving it a go, because like everything, the theoretical knowledge is one thing, but once you get out there and start looking at the plants and getting into it, that's when the knowledge really starts to take off.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much, Doris, for this wealth of information and this whole world you've opened up for everyone today. I know I'm going to be going home to try some mallow tea to try and soothe the bit of a cold that I've got at the moment. So there's so many practical tips that you've provided us all with today.
Great.
And I want to thank all our guests for joining in and partaking in this workshop today. And I hope you found some really useful information that you're going to be able to use in your ongoing culinary efforts. And yeah, just a reminder that we've recorded today's presentation and we'll share it with registered attendees on Monday. And we'll provide a few links to Doris's books as well, just in case you didn't get those website addresses earlier. So yeah, I think that's where we'll leave it. And thanks everyone for attending, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks everyone
Doris.
for coming along.
Bye.
Bye.